Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you very much for joining us today. In this webinar, we hope to clear up some of the confusion around IDDSI food texture testing methods and answer some of the common questions that have recently been submitted by industry partners. We have designed the session for those who have roles that research, tests, design, manufacture, market, and sell, or consult regarding texture modified foods. For those of you who are in the food service operations or have a clinical role, we will be hosting future webinars for these groups as well. As mentioned in the Getting Ready email, we hope that you have been able to gather the suggested items so that you can virtually and actively participate along with our wonderful presenters. The session is being recorded so that it can be made available to all those who were not able to join us today. All participants will be in a listen-only mode. And if you'd like to ask a question, please use the Q&A function in the Zoom control panel. Please identify yourself with your first name and where you're from, and our panelists will do their best to answer your questions in the order in which they're submitted. If there are questions on similar topics, the panelists may try to answer them together so that we can get to as many questions as possible. Certificates of attendance will be sent out to all webinar participants who attended this live webinar. If you have joined us online, we will already have a record of your attendance. For those who may have joined us by phone, please take a moment to email meetings@iddsi.org so that we can make sure you receive a copy of the certificate of attendance. Those who may be watching this webinar on our YouTube channel, we will not be issuing certificates of attendance for just watching the webinar. This webinar has not been pre-approved for any CEUs or professional development credits. Participants will need to check with their respective professional organizations or accrediting bodies regarding CEUs or professional development credits. We would like to thank all of these wonderful sponsors who have supported our work right at the start and continue to support our work so that we can continue what we're doing now to help facilitate global implementation of IDDSI. I am thrilled to introduce you to our presenters, Dr. Katrina Steele. Dr. Katrina Steele is an IDDSI board member, and she is also the research lead for IDDSI. Dr. Joseph Murray, who is a past IDDSI board member, and he's currently leading the IDDSI implementation in the VA. Dr. Luis Riquelme is an IDDSI board member, and he currently leads all of the translation management so that the IDDSI terminology can be available to many people in many languages. And I am Peter Lam, IDDSI co-chair, and we're thrilled once again to welcome you. So what are we doing today? In this particular webinar, we'd like to briefly go over what is IDDSI, talk about the safety risks that are associated with drink thickness and food texture, have a bit of an exploration of predicted and expected classifications, take you through an interactive tour of the IDDSI testing methods, and why might testing results differ from expectations, and what should a texture label communicate, and then close off the session today with answering your questions and discussion. So let me hand it over to Katrina.
Thanks, Peter, and hello, everyone. So I will get started with a general introduction to IDDSI and some in-depth exploration of levels 3 and 4 on the IDDSI framework. An important difference between IDDSI and previous approaches to classifying foods and liquids is that the IDDSI framework is not a system of diets. Rather, it is a system of labels or terminology that can be used to describe the properties of foods and liquids based on a set of tests, And these tests have been developed to be user-friendly so that they can be performed by anyone. A very key message that we want to communicate is that the IDDSI framework is descriptive rather than prescriptive. IDDSI tests can be used to understand the properties of foods and liquids that are available for patients, but the determination of which levels on the framework are suitable for a particular patient is something that needs to be based on assessment by a qualified clinician. The primary motivation behind developing the IDDSI framework was to improve safety for people with dysphagia. Confusion when referring to the characteristics of foods and liquids represents a safety risk for people with dysphagia, and our goal is to establish clear communication to mitigate and eliminate that risk. So what do we mean by the word safety when we are talking about diets for people with swallowing impairment? Here we mean that a person can swallow food and liquid without aspirating material into their airway, that they can achieve good bolus clearance without leaving material behind in the pharynx, and that they can swallow material without blocking their airway and causing a choking emergency. And these three goals help us to identify risky characteristics of food and liquid that need to be managed, such as how thin a liquid is, how sticky material is, and how large the particles of food are in a bolus. When we swallow, we have to be able to manage the fact that the throat is a single passage with two functions. First, the throat is a pathway for air to move in and out of the body for breathing and speech production. Second, the throat is a pathway for food and liquid to move through in swallowing. Safe swallowing requires reconfiguration of the throat so that it stops being a pathway for breathing and becomes a pathway for ingestion. And this requires closing the entrance to the voice box or the larynx and opening the entrance to the esophagus, as well as a series of muscle contractions that move a bolus down through the pharynx. In this animation, you can see that the airway is actually open while the bolus is held in the mouth, but closes as the bolus passes on its way to the esophagus. In people with swallowing impairment, we are very concerned about penetration aspiration, or the entry of material into the airway. When this happens, it suggests that the airway did not close properly, or perhaps that it did not close at the right time. We recommend thickened liquids for people with dysphagia because these liquids move more slowly, and this gives the patient extra time in which to get their airway closed before the bolus reaches that danger zone. Several studies, including a recent paper from my lab, confirm that the risk of aspiration is significantly reduced with thicker liquids. In this example of a swallowing X-ray or a video fluoroscopy, we see a patient who is unable to achieve functional airway protection, resulting in serious aspiration. When a clinician recommends thickened liquids, they should be clear about how thick they want the material to be. On this slide, you see an illustration of the IDDSI flow test, where we look at how much material is left behind in a standard 10 milliliter slip-tip syringe after 10 seconds of flow. Provided that you use the correct syringe for this test, it is valid and highly reliable for determining whether a liquid falls into level 0, 1, or 2 of the IDDSI framework. But as you can see on the right hand of the image, once we get into levels 3 and 4, additional tests are needed. The first of these additional tests is the IDDSI fork drip test. This test confirms whether a liquid is behaving more like a level 3 moderately thick liquid or a level 4 extremely thick liquid. Level 3 liquids will drip through the tines of a fork in dollops, whereas level 4 liquids will mound on top of the fork and they won't drip through. To demonstrate this, we are going to do a virtual interactive activity, and I hope you have supplies with you so that you can experience these tests yourself. So for this first virtual active demonstration, we're going to look at the fork drip test. And we're specifically interested in confirming whether a product is level 3 or level 4, or maybe not behaving as expected. I want to start with a liquid that you might have some assumptions about, which is honey. And I chose this because, of course, we used to call liquids honey thick liquids, and that's a really ambiguous term. And so I have here some commercially available honey, and I've preloaded a syringe so that I can show you how it behaves in the flow test to begin with. So I have a clean syringe here, and I'm going to fill it with 10 milliliters of the honey. So I'm at 10 milliliters on the syringe, and now I'm going to use my watch as a timer and let it drip into the bowl for 10 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Now, you may have noticed that only a couple of drops came out of the syringe. Really, we're still at 9.8 on the syringe. And so this is probably in the moderately thick range, but it really didn't flow. And this honey may have a property called yield stress, where it has some surface tension and doesn't flow very well. So the next question regarding this honey is, how does it flow through the tines of a fork in the IDDSI fork drip test? To do the IDDSI fork drip test, you need to be able to immerse your fork into the bowl, and then you need to be able to lift the fork out of the bowl and observe what happens. And so I have the fork immersed in the honey, and you're going to see that really it's a very thin strand initially, and then it starts to sort of separate into dollops. So really this honey is not behaving as we would describe a moderately thick liquid. The stream is too thin through the tines of a fork, and so this is displaying a product that may change its behavior in certain conditions. Temperature would be a relevant factor to understand here as well, but really this is a little bit too thin once you apply the fork drip test. And so I've got a second liquid here that I want to demonstrate fork drip testing with, and that is a commercially available plum sauce. And so here I have it in my container, and I'm immersing my fork again, and I'm going to lift it up, and you'll see, in contrast to what we saw with the honey, that here we have dollops falling through the tines of the fork. I'll show you again. Try and get a little bit more on my fork. So with moderately thick liquids, it's actually quite difficult to load a reasonable amount on your fork because it falls through the tines of the fork. And this is a good example of a liquid that is behaving as a moderately thick liquid and dolloping through the tines of the fork. A third example I want to show you is applesauce. And applesauce is used very frequently in dysphagia management. It's often used as a way to serve pills, for example. And people have assumptions about applesauce, and yet applesauce can vary in its consistency from brand to brand. So here I have a commercially available applesauce, and I hope you can see here that it has some lumps in it and maybe some looser or more liquid components to it. And so really it's not smooth enough to meet the requirements of IDDSI level 4 in this state. If we were to do the fork drip test with this product, it can easily load and mound on the fork, and it doesn't drip through. But because there are lumps in this applesauce that I think you can see clearly, it's really not meeting all of the definitions of an IDDSI level 4 extremely thick liquid. So I threw it in my blender before recording here, just for a couple of seconds. And so now I have applesauce that has been pureed so that it's more smooth. And the question is, does it still test as an IDDSI level 4 extremely thick liquid? And what does it look like on the fork drip test? So here I have a fork and my product. And here you can see pretty well a stereotypical level 4 IDDSI fork test result, where we see a tail of the applesauce hanging through the fork, but not actively flowing or dripping. So now that we have looked at how thick a liquid is, we also need to consider whether it is too thick. When liquids are too thick or sticky, residue can be left behind in the pharynx. And recent evidence confirms that residue in the pharynx does increase the risk of aspirating. On this video, you can see an example of a patient who has residue in the pharynx after the swallow. In order to manage the risk of residue, we want to make sure that thick boluses are not too sticky. And for this, we use the IDDSI spoon tilt test, which I will illustrate in a short video clip. So in this second virtual active demonstration, we want to look at the spoon tilt test. And here we're looking at whether the product is sticky and adherent, and also whether it holds together in a cohesive bolus. And so for this, I've got those same two applesauce products that we had before, the one straight out of the bottle and the one that's been in my blender for a couple of seconds. So let's start with the one that is straight out of the bottle. And so here we're going to again immerse our spoon, this time in the product, lift it up and tilt and see if it falls off in a cohesive bolus and what kind of residue it leaves behind. So if I tilt this spoon, you'll see that most of the applesauce fell off. There is still some left behind. You can see that it's sort of collected at the bottom of the tilted spoon. And at the top of the tilted spoon, it's cleared the spoon quite cleanly, only leaving a little bit of residue behind. So it's not demonstrating that it's very sticky. If we do the same demonstration with the blended applesauce that went through my blender, we get this result. So my spoon's in, I lift it up, it falls off in 2 lumps. This time we're seeing a little bit more coating on the spoon, but it's quite translucent and not very sticky. So both of these applesauce products would pass the spoon tilt test, demonstrating cohesiveness and not too much adhesiveness. Before I hand off to Joe to discuss tests for level 5 minced and moist foods, I want to leave you with one final comment. And that is that we should never assume that we know the IDDSI level of a food or a drink based on the product name. Unfortunately, words can be misleading, and on the slide are just 3 situations where the name of a product might lead you to have a particular expectation about the characteristics of that product, but where you might be wrong. So our guidance is that you should never assume a consistency, and you should always test to be certain. If you're a manufacturer of products with names that imply consistency, we encourage you to base your claims about consistency in IDDSI testing and to communicate the conditions and results of those tests in your product information.
Thank you, Katrina, for that instructive session, and I look forward to hearing Luis Riquelme talk again after my session here. We're going to move now out of the lower triangle and move firmly into the triangle that's dedicated for food. And we're going to talk about levels 5 and 6 of the framework. We have a video that's playing now that shows, it's in a loop, I'll have you all know. It shows a person chewing food, preparing it into a cohesive bolus, and then advancing it through the pharynx. This is a normal swallow. And you can see good, strong chewing, good contact of teeth, good motion of the tongue to collect the bolus, and then piston-like motion of the tongue to push it down completely through the pharynx and down into the esophagus. And so we can go to the next slide. And so in a normal sense, we would expect that good oral processing should reduce the particle size of whole foods through this mastication and advancement of the bolus. So we do know a few things about oral processing and nutrient intake. And the idea here is to maximize nutrient intake for our patients that may have some impairment. And so we know that the better the oral processing behavior is, the greater the rate of nutrient intake. And we also see increases in body mass and other measures of good nutrition in those that have good oral processing behaviors. And we know that these behaviors can be enhanced by having a good dental status, having good jaw muscle activity, good bite force, good tongue pressure, and good oral volume. Being able to take a mouthful of food and manipulate it is extremely important. Now, in levels 5 and 6, we're going to be filling a much needed gap in the previously designed frameworks, such as the National Dysphagia Diet and others that jump from a puree consistency that Katrina described extremely well to a highly variable and rather vaguely described texture that might range from ground textures to soft textured whole foods. And so the new IDDSI framework, I think, really fills this chasm that was neglected in previous structured frameworks. And so we saw considerable movement of the tongue and mastication and very powerful advancement of the bolus in that video example. Now, when someone has trouble with oral processing and intake, we can find that the rate of oral intake is reduced, and you have an associated reduction in nutrition and in nutrient intake. And this can cause a downward spiral in ability and an advancement of disability across systemic health. Wound healing becomes poor, ability to ambulate becomes poor, overall function and ability to take care of daily needs is reduced when nutrient intake is poor. And so simple aging can contribute to this. Edentulosum, or in other words, you can advance the slide. Edentulosum, or loss of teeth, that is very often associated with aging, but can also be associated with different disease processes. There may be reduced salivary flow in elders or in those that are being treated for different conditions. As a matter of fact, xerostomia, or a dry mouth, is one of the most frequently listed side effects of drugs in the physician's desk reference. And so very, very frequent that we're seeing reduced salivary flow. If there's neuromuscular disease, there may be a weakness of jaw motion or bite force. And in patients that have head and neck cancer or other medical conditions, there may be structural changes to the oral cavity. Or there may be weakness from a disease process that may lead to fatigue and a reduction of oral intake. And so it's this downward spiral that we want to avoid. You can advance the slide. And so we're going to talk about levels 5 and 6 now. This is our crack nutrition and food service team. We have one of our chefs there in the background, and clinical dietitians and nutrition and food service staff, dietitians and production folks. At our test kitchen, we have a bi-weekly test kitchen meeting where we review new creations from the chef for the different IDDSI levels. And on this particular day, we were reviewing level 5 minced and moist creations. And each of the dietitians, speech pathologists, and other kitchen workers are invited as well to take part in this. We use the different methods that Katrina described and some of the methods that I'll be describing now to test these to determine whether they match up with the IDDSI framework. And we'll show you some successes and failures here in just a moment. So let's talk just a little bit about particle size. You can advance the slide there. So we're going to use a fork pressure test for the level 5 minced and moist level. We'll be using the gaps of the fork tines to make a determination as to whether a particle size is large enough to fall into the framework. And typically, most forks will have about 4 millimeters between the tines, and this provides us with a fairly useful compliance measure for the particle size for this level. And so if you have a reference card in front of you and a fork, go ahead and place the fork over the reference card and see if your fork tine matches that gap. You can advance the slide. We can see some examples. This is a chicken tetrazzini. This actually fell well within the range of level 4. They used a small pasta. You could use orzo, stelline, fragola, acini di pepe. Any of the small pastas will fit nicely between the fork tines. It's moist. It has good cohesiveness without being too sticky. The real beauty of the level 5 is that it has a mouthfeel for the food after it's been reduced from chewing in its natural state, in its prepared state. And so it emulates chewing very well. And so an edentate patient or someone without any teeth can press this food between the gums and express flavor from the food without the risk of having large pieces of food fall into the airway that could obstruct the airway. And so we're finding that this minced and moist level is very frequently displacing puree foods in our recommendation as speech pathologists, and our test kitchen has been cranking out recipes. You can advance the slide to another example. This is another pasta dish with an orzo, and these also fell well within the measurement, the guidelines for level 4. They're also taste very much like the originating dish rather than a mushy mouth feel. You have the feel and resistance of a pasta in your mouth without the risk of obstructing the airway. You can advance the slide and we'll show a video here. Now we're going to show 2 versions of this baked cod dish that came across. This is the level 5 minced and moist. We have peas and carrots that have been reduced in particle size. You can see with the fork tilt test that they're falling off and mound nicely on the fork. The particle size is pushing through the fork tines rather nicely for the peas and carrots. There's an example of a piece of carrot that was pulled. Typically in our auditing process, we'll pull the largest particle off the dish and then place it on our either a reference card or through the tines of the fork. Here's a piece of cod, and the cod fibers are easily separated. This one is within 4 millimeters width, and we'll recall that in level 5 minced and moist, the particle size can be a width of 4 millimeters, but as long as 1.5 centimeters. And so this particle of easily stranded cod actually fell nicely within level 4. Let's advance the slide if we can. And so let's talk a little bit about now level 6 soft and bite size. This is a great addition to the framework as well. Biting's not required, chewing is required. And so we need that mastication that we saw in the video earlier. Food pieces are designed to minimize choking risk, and we'll talk about that in just a bit. You still need some tongue force and control to move the bolus through the pharynx and down through the upper esophagus. Patients who may have pain or fatigue on chewing or missing teeth or poorly fitting dentures may be appropriate for this diet. We've also found, particularly in our patients with delirium, and we found this during the COVID crisis, that many patients that are recovering from a period of extended ICU stay have lots of trouble cognitively and had considerable difficulty manipulating food on a tray. They either had cognitive difficulties from hypoxia, sustained delirium, or poor executive function. And so they were unable to manipulate food on the tray. While they could safely chew it and swallow it, they could not actually reduce the food using utensils. And so having something that is already cut and chopped up turned out to be a good advantage for these folks. Self-feeding helps with orientation, and it also emulated natural food much more closely than the minced moist or the pureed consistencies that would have been at a lower tier than the level 6 soft and bite size. So we could advance the slide here. And so let's take a look at particle size and why particle size may be important. In order to do this, we have to introduce you to a new view here. And so we're showing the same swallow demonstrated with different instruments. On the right side, we see the fluoroscopic view, and we can see that there's a line here. That's a laryngoscope. And the laryngoscope has a little camera in the tip of the scope, and it will illuminate the throat and show us the bottom of the throat and the airway. We're circling the airway now. And that's the view that we have on the left. And we can see the larynx there and the airway and the path leading down to the trachea and the lower airways, the lungs. And so we could advance the slide. And what we're seeing here now is just that laryngoscopic view. We're looking at the airway itself. This is the area just behind what you would call your voice box, or the prominence in your throat, that is made up of cartilage that's covering this grouping of tissue that is designed to protect the lower airways and has a secondary function of producing speech. And so the larynx rises above the floor of the pharynx and creates a nice barrier to the lower airways. It's structured to guide food into the area below the epiglottis here. And the epiglottis is this leaf-like structure, and then around to collecting points in the bottom of the throat. And so on each side, we have a collecting point called the piriform sinus down, that's right, down there, and down on the subject's left side, our right side. In the middle there, that delta-shaped area, the V-shaped area, are the vocal folds and the entry down into the lower airway. And so this is where our voice comes from. It's also a gateway to prevent food or liquid from entering the lower airways. We could actually, the size of an adult airway is about 1.8 centimeters squared. And so there's some variation in positioning of the head, but this is the size that is a typical adult airway. Let's take a look now. We can advance just the slide here. We can see how nicely liquid flows around the airway. This is some milk with a little bit of green dye in it. You can see that the larynx acts like a fortress, and it will, in a passive way, guide food and liquid around and into a safer spot before the swallow is initiated. We could advance this slide. And so let's take a look at the same cod dish here. And this is the level 6 soft and bite size. We're going to test the softness with the fork, and it certainly passes that. But holy cow, when we look at the size of the largest particle coming off the tray, that piece of cod is much larger than a 1.5 centimeter standard. We see the piece of corn and the pea fall well within the range of the bite size according to the reference card. And so if we can advance now, we can take a look at the peril associated with having a large particle. This is a piece of Jell-O, and so it would seem inoffensive sitting on the tray, and a size that may be fairly similar to, actually bigger than the piece of cod that we were showing, but clearly it will obstruct the airway. And this is the video fluoroscopic view. You can see it sliding in and out of the larynx and being expectorated by the patient who has not made an attempt to reduce it in size through mastication. And this can occur in a patient with poor cognitive function or poor executive function, or with delirium as well. And so very important that the size of the particle is not going to obstruct the airway. That's why the 1.5 centimeter size was determined. Here is our reference card and some peach and pear pieces. We picked a typical piece of peach out and placed it on the reference card for size. And you can see it's a little bit bigger than 1.5 centimeters. So let's advance the slide to the video. This is the laryngoscopic view again. We're going to show a piece of peach that's a little bit smaller here. And we're going to show it on the reference card. And so you can see this will fall within the range of level 6 soft and bite size, slightly smaller than 1.5 centimeters. Now we're taking that exact same piece of peach and advancing it into the pharynx. And when we compare the size of that very small particle of peach, I think you'll agree, it looks like the Rock of Gibraltar compared to the structure of the larynx. Very close in size to the open airway there. It's being trapped by the epiglottis, and it won't be moving further down into the airway. A swallow occurs and clears it. Now let's take a look at a slightly bigger piece of peach, and you can see this falls just beyond the range of 1.5 centimeters. And so a little bit bigger, let's advance this down into the laryngeal airway, and you can see it's going to completely obstruct the airway. And so this particle size is an extremely important marker for safety. We're going to look at this in slow motion now. We're going to see that same piece of peach advanced into the laryngeal airway, and we're going to see it slide down into the entryway to the airway, and this is capable of blocking and causing asphyxiation. And so very important that the particle size is adhered to in this particular framework range. And we can advance the slide now. And so as we reflect on these two levels, I think we can think about a couple of things. First, they provide a great opportunity for patients to enjoy food textures that express flavor in a more natural way, and also offer a greater range of visual appeal than a puree food. And so we're finding that patients are consuming this level of the framework at a greater rate than they consume a puree or molded consistency because of the appeal and because of the mouthfeel and because of the naturalness of the textures. And so great advantage to developing these sorts of products. I think that they would be welcomed by folks as end users. As we reflect on these, we have to consider that safe swallowing is dependent on appropriate oral preparation of a bolus, efficiency of the propulsion of the bolus, and speed of the onset of swallowing. And manipulating texture reduces choking risk by keeping within the particle size for the framework, and facilitates the breakdown of food in those that can't break it down, that may have poor mastication, and increases the efficiency and reduces fatigue for those that cannot depend on mastication or on manipulating food manually for feeding. And so the whole goal here is to increase the efficiency of oral intake, to increase nutrition, and to increase the overall health of the patient. With that, I'll hand it over to Dr. Riquelme.
Thank you, Joe. Well, now that we have seen some incredible graphics and great explanations of risk for choking, and hopefully we're now breathing again after seeing that peach slide, that's a piece of peach just slide right into the airway. Let's talk about what people say, oh, that's fine, level 7, it's the regular, anything that doesn't fit into the framework. But that's not really the case. Some years back, based on requests from the end users, we found that we needed to look at creating a subcategory of level 7, and hence the easy to chew level 7 was created. This subcategory was introduced following a global request, as I said, to have a category for softer foods for people with mild issues with oral processing or who show slight fatigue during chewing. So maybe some of the folks without teeth or edentulous, as Joe had mentioned, and or possibly some of the folks that might be decompensated and could use something a little softer. It is not recommended for people who are at risk for suffocation due to incomplete chewing, taking too large a bite, or eating too quickly. The fork separation test and the fork pressure tests are used to determine if a food is soft enough and can be broken down easily. Next slide, please. So here what you're seeing is a video, and what we wanted to highlight is the complexity, and this might not illustrate it fully, but of chewing, of what we call oral processing. And I think it's important to see here that, you know, once the bolus or once the food is mixed with saliva, it is pushed towards the back and then just makes it right through the pharynx into the esophagus. What we don't often talk about is the influence of taste, temperature, texture, and volume of that bolus on really coordinating and programming how long we're chewing, how many cycles we're chewing for, at what point do we propel that, that bolus towards the back to then trigger the swallow. So taste, temperature, texture, volume have a major impact on oral processing and programming of the overall swallow response and the force needed to get that bolus into the cervical esophagus. Next slide, please. So you've heard about and you've seen the fork pressure test, right? The blanching of the thumbnail. But there's also the fork or spoon separation test, which both are helpful to determine if foods are easy to chew. So always think about the potential for choking related to particle size. So as you see here, with the fork on its side, or it could be a spoon on its side, the food, you know, breaks apart easily without needing much force on it. So that is, in a nutshell, how we take a look at some of the items that might qualify for the easy to chew within the IDDSI framework. Next slide, please. And here's a point on regular. So when we're looking at level 7 regular, and we're thinking about oral processing, I must thank Dr. Steele for the photos here. Here we see raw baby carrots that were chewed 20 times by 4 different healthy adults. And right at the point of swallowing, they spit it out. There's no nicer way to say it. And look at how differently 4 different healthy adults actually chewed or processed a bite of a baby carrot. All the way to the right, you see there is a lot more mixture with saliva, for example. That's a much more cohesive bolus versus the first 2 on the left, where the particles are still easily separable. And remember, this was at the point where the person was ready to swallow. So that's an illustration of the differences in how we manage different textures. We also might manage different textures in different ways by bite. So you might be eating, let's say, a piece of meat, and you might chew it a certain amount of times. Your first bite, by the time you're on your 3rd bite, you might chew it less, you might chew it more. So there's variability within a meal itself as well. That's just a big point to make. Next slide, please. So another point we make in our framework, and you see it from levels 5 through 7, are these transitional foods. And these are foods that may start at a level, let's say at a level 6 and change to a level 3, for example. So they start at one level and they end up in the other once they're mixed with saliva, or once they're exposed to the temperature, let's say body temperature, etc. You know, I always love to point out plantain chips on your upper left, or potato chips on the bottom left, which seem fairly innocent. They're basically a nice solid. You place it in your mouth, and by the time you are ready to swallow that material, it is a completely different level. These foods are often used with children that present with developmental delays or disorders, or with adults that may need rehabilitation for chewing. We need to attend to what level food texture is being swallowed once it comes in contact with the saliva temperature or the water, as I said. These are not foods that we typically use with persons with dysphagia. The risk for choking is too great, and different transitional foods respond in different ways by different people. So that is an important message to clarify the use of transitional foods. Next slide. So you're wondering if we have to mix it with saliva, etc. How can we test it? And to date, the best way to do that would be to take a sample, a 1.5 centimeter by 1.5 centimeter, and apply the fork pressure test, right? The thumbnail blanching, and the sample should not return to its original shape. Once you have, oh, I apologize, I forgot to tell you that you need to add the 1 milliliter of water to that sample and let it sit for a minute. Then you apply the fork pressure test, and it should retain its, or it shouldn't go back to its regular shape once the fork is removed. That's how you would test the transitional foods and what they might be like at the point of triggering that swallow. Next slide, please. Here we make a point of mixed consistencies. And you might think, oh, this is a nice little bowl of some grain, right, etc. But look at the sauce, and we point it out right there. Now you have a liquid, and that's different than the more solid texture that is displayed. We often get questions about this, things like soups, for example, that might present with a variety of textures or IDDSI levels in one serving. And they certainly would present a danger to a person with dysphagia. Again, the food item served has to be tested, as well as the liquid, and we need to then match them to the IDDSI levels that are safest for that particular patient. Next slide, please. So here are some other examples. The fruit cups are often popular. You see that we have issues with the bite size, but we also have issues with the fact that there's syrup in there. And so again, you have a liquid. Is that a level of liquid that the patient can swallow safely? And how could the patient manage both textures at once? And you also have, again, here we have some beans in the bottom left, but there is a lot of liquid that would then, again, separate and create a not great scenario for a patient with difficulties there. Next slide, please. So we hope that this overview has given you an idea of not only the complexities of connecting the IDDSI framework with swallowing physiology and with what's safe for the patient, but also seeing the variety of tests available so that controlling for temperature and as many other variables as possible, we can go ahead and provide the best materials to each patient. This simple testing reference guide is available on our website, IDDSI.org, for download, and it explains what the appropriate tests are for the different IDDSI framework levels. Next slide, please. And here are some other references that we have available on our website. You have this big poster that also explains the levels and has them all broken down and explains, again, some of the tests. Next slide. And again, the testing reference card and the flow test and food test cards. These are all downloadable and printable. And of course, the business card size templates here available, and you saw that Joe actually used them to measure particle size. So great resources available on our website. Next slide. And so, Peter, I believe I pass this on to you.
Thank you, Luis. Thank you, Joe, Katrina, Luis, for setting all this up and hoping everybody on the webinar today has found the information helpful. We thought we would just take a few moments just to either introduce this document to those who've never seen it before, or just to remind those who have seen this document before. IDDSI actually has developed some product labeling guidelines. And really what we're wanting to do is just to make sure that the product labeling that you're doing is most helpful to the consumers. The first thing that we've asked is please don't include the IDDSI framework or the IDDSI logo on your product labels. We do not want to give the impression in any way that IDDSI actually has endorsed, certified, tested, verified, whatever term we want to use, so that it's actually fair to all manufacturers, that you are actually conducting your own testing and you are actually then providing that kind of information and most helpful information that would be available to the consumers. We do encourage you to use the IDDSI icons, the triangular icons, as well as the labeling. We would like to say, if at all possible, use at least 2 out of the 3 identifiers, meaning the color, the label, or the number. If you can use all 3, it would be ideal. But if you cannot use all 3 on your label, then at least use 2 out of the 3. It would be wonderful if you can follow the color guide that we have available for you on the website. Again, the colors have been specifically chosen. They have been subjected to color blindness tests, so that even with the most severe of color identifying challenges and color blindness, people can still distinguish between the different levels that have been identified. We also ask, if at all possible, please reference people back to the IDDSI website, IDDSI.org, so that people know where the information is coming from. Other things that consumers have recommended or provide us with feedback in terms of what would be helpful on labels or product information, and you can see them listed here. Consumers are really wishing some detailed preparation or holding instructions. And we know that, you know, in some cases, people may not read these as carefully, but it would be nice to have some detailed preparation and holding instructions, because we know that the characteristic of food and drinks can change with different preparation techniques or holding methods. It would be also ideal to identify the optimal service temperatures or temperature ranges and the conditions for service as well as holding. If at all possible, recommend the accompanying IDDSI testing methods. We have IDDSI audit tools available on our website. They are being updated at the moment so that they are fillable PDF documents with checkmark buttons that can be used in a smart device. And so we're going to get those out in the next little while. And then what would be really good for the consumers to see is also the testing conditions for whatever labeled level the product is supposed to be. And again, temperature range, holding time, and those conditions identified would be very, very helpful for the consumers. Any changes that you have seen with time, temperature, moisture loss, if that can be identified also on your product information, it'll be very helpful, not only for the people that are preparing and serving the food, but it will also be very helpful for clinicians to know what may happen so that when they conduct their clinical evaluations with specific individuals, they can also identify that perhaps some of these changes, when it gets to this particular characteristic, it may not at that point then be appropriate for the person's challenges. And then ultimately, it would be great if there is a possibility of adding, what do you do with the food once it's been held for this length of time? Is there actually a way to help to refresh it back to an ideal product? So perhaps it's temperature change that has occurred. Do we now want to ask people to reheat the product to get it back to that ideal temperature range so that it can behave in the ideal manner? Do we ask people to add moisture to the food just to make sure that it can be, again, in an ideal behavior? Do we check it again with the IDDSI tests so that perhaps it's midway through a meal, nearing the end of a meal, so that we can make sure the products that you're providing for consumers can be the most ideal product for the patients. We have recently also published some guidelines about the creation of materials about IDDSI. Recently, we were made aware of a number of outdated documents, documents with inaccurate information, websites or web pages, even blogs that have information that actually conflict with what is available on the IDDSI website. And so these two guidelines are available now on the IDDSI website under the resources page. We're, again, just asking people, please don't use the IDDSI logo in websites or web pages, blogs, or products that you are producing, just to not mislead people to think that it is an official IDDSI document. We found some documents with great intentions that were produced by health authorities, by various healthcare companies that were really trying to promote IDDSI, but because the information provided had changed over time with updates, people were thinking that this was actually still the official information provided by IDDSI. We're also asking people that if you are providing resource materials or putting up a website to explain about IDDSI, please include a very clearly visible statement about the resources, the educational materials, and if at all possible, please let people know that these are not official IDDSI resources, educational materials, or educational programs, and that the information that you have provided is not meant to replace the IDDSI materials. And then again, if you can refer people back to the website, it would be much appreciated. We are saying that please go ahead and use the IDDSI framework in the way that it's shown here, with the IDDSI logo attached to the framework and the appropriate Creative Commons citation. We would really hope that when you use this framework with its appropriate citation, that you don't tear it apart. So please don't use just the foods side of the framework or the drinks side of the framework. If you wish to highlight one, then use the entire framework and maybe just, you know, circle, put some kind of highlighting around the side that you are referring to. If possible, please avoid any inclusion of materials that are already on the IDDSI website or videos, either into the web pages, websites. Ideally, it would be good to put a link to the IDDSI videos or the IDDSI materials or the IDDSI webinar, because on occasion, we will update those videos. We may update the links. And so ideally point people to the IDDSI YouTube channel, because that will be a constant. The videos within the IDDSI channel may be modified, but at least people will still be able to find them in the IDDSI YouTube channel or the IDDSI website. And so the last thing we're going to ask for everyone's cooperation, which is IDDSI resources and publications that are freely available on the IDDSI website. It has always been our philosophy and our goal to make sure that these are readily available and freely available to all persons. And so we do discourage the sale of any material or resources that are freely accessible and freely available. So thank you for respecting these guidelines, and we thank you for, you know, all that you're doing to promote IDDSI, but we really want to avoid any type of confusion with our consumers. Ultimately, if you're looking for information, please go to the IDDSI website. We are going to be undergoing a bit of a refreshing of the website to try to make it much easier for people to find information. We'll point out the fact that the most popular section of our website is the resources section, and you'll see the resources tab here. When you click on this tab, there may be a few levels that you need to go through to find the materials that you're looking for. If you have not taken the time before to look through the website, please take a few moments to do so. This is really just bringing us full circle and reminding everyone the reason why we're doing what we're doing. If you are not aware of the fact that the IDDSI Board of Directors are all volunteers, well, we're letting you know we are all volunteers, and we do the work that we do for IDDSI off the side of our desks. And the purpose, the main purpose is to improve safety. And we hope that you'll be partners with us in this journey of improving safety through the use of the common terminology for all ages, all care settings, and all cultures. We've left plenty of time, and we really want to now use this time to answer the questions that you might have. So if you have a question that you would like us to address, please go to the Zoom menu bar and you will see the Q&A button. Click on that Q&A button and please type in your question, and we will be happy to answer them for you. Okay, Alan, if you don't mind unmuting the panelists. So we have a question from Peter. The question is, with the spoon tilt test, there's some indication that a little shake could be used during the test in IDDSI documentation. Is this still an acceptable practice as the applesauce seemed to work okay in the test in the video. Katrina, I'm going to hand that over to you.
Sure. Hopefully everybody can hear me. So thank you, Peter, for the question. You're correct that in the instructions for the spoon tilt test, we talk about the bolus falling off the spoon either by itself or with a little bit of a shake. I think the words a light flick might be used. And this, of course, is a subjective thing. What we don't want is to see people shaking the fork really hard or the spoon really hard to dislodge the material. So yes, it's acceptable. I think it's better if the material slides off without needing help, because that's suggesting some adherence and adhesiveness that might translate to stickiness in the actual bolus. And you have another question lower down about stickiness. And so maybe I'll deal with that at the same time, Peter. The question is that the stickiness issue is often an issue. And can I talk about what specific conditions would show or define a more dangerous situation where stickiness can be confirmed as not acceptable? Really, this is the way we've described it in the framework is that a lot of the material sticks, that it's hard to dislodge, and that we've used the word that it's not translucent, so it's a thicker portion of the bolus that remains behind. And it is, again, subjective and hard to quantify. These are aspects that we hope to work on in the future. But Peter, do you have anything to add about that one?
Yeah, we are working with a group of culinary experts as well as food scientists at the moment to try to even elaborate on the definitions that we've provided. And so please stay tuned. With regards to the shaking of the spoon, we recently included an article in one of our e-bites to talk about the extent of shaking. So what we've asked people to do is take the spoon, and as you hold the spoon, the only thing that really should move is your wrist. And so that's the extent in which you should be flicking the spoon in order to check whether or not that material has come off the spoon. If there are any arm movements at all, then I think we are now shaking a little too vigorously to try to get that food off the spoon. And Katrina, you covered it beautifully earlier when you said a light coating on the spoon after the material has come off is still okay. And yes, absolutely. If there's a translucency still left on that coating where you can actually still see the shininess of the spoon, that's completely okay. And so bear with us. We're trying to get things more defined, especially for industry partners, manufacturers, research and development. But based on best information that is available, this is what we've recommended so that this test method can be accessible and available to everyone testing level 4 pureed foods or level 4 extremely thick liquids. Okay. And so
can I go on to another one that Peter's also asked? So the question is, if a food is tested and is deemed to pass all IDDSI food tests, but then a customer informs you that they weren't successful in getting the same test results, is the recommendation that they should not use the product, or simply that it was successful in handling in the testing phase at your premises? So this is a really, really important question. The fact is that before IDDSI, consumers, patients, caregivers, nursing staff, any of these end users didn't have access to tests. And so they had to take food and drink at its face value and assume that it was within the range that it was labeled for. But we know that both foods and liquids may change in their characteristics. We've seen variation across batches coming out of factories, and you would have a tolerance level if that's the kind of product you're producing. Peter's spoken to the fact that products may change with temperature changes. And so it's quite likely that the consistency that something leaves the kitchen in may change before it's time to serve it to the patient. And so by making IDDSI testing accessible, the idea is that we're actually empowering people to understand whether the product might have changed and no longer be appropriate for a patient at the point of service. One of the places we've seen this be most useful actually is with babies and formula, which is usually warmed before they drink it. And then as it cools down, it may get thicker. And so as the baby, if they're having a very long feed, it may get more difficult for them to drink the formula, partly because they're getting tired, but partly because the product has thickened as it cooled. So in terms of, this is where I think it's so important as manufacturers that you communicate the conditions under which the product met the testing requirements, and you communicate the expected performance of that product under expected serving conditions, but recognize that there might be some variation, and whether the variation is clinically significant and represents a sort of dangerous change in the product is something that the clinician, the patient or the caregiver should be advised to discuss with the clinician. And then this is where Peter's comments about perhaps having suggestions on how they could return the product to a safe range might come into play, or it might be that it's not salvageable and they should really set that aside and get a fresh serving. That covered it adequately, Peter?
Yeah, thank you, Katrina. We'll move on to a question from Karen. Can you elaborate as to how the piece of cod aligned with level 5? She thought that the product had to have particle size already established, not to be manipulated to the particle size. And what was discussed was different than how she understood the level 5 guidelines. And Joe, I think we'll hand that over to you if you don't mind.
Yeah, it's a great question, and clearly both Mr. Rick and Ms. Sutters had eagle eyes, and it wasn't explained well. There is manipulation of the food with the fork, and I think if you look at the guidelines, it suggests that the fork can separate the particles and that they can pass through the tines of the fork. And so I pulled a section of the cod up and spread it out. And I think I could have spread it to the point to pull the other particles away. I think it wasn't a good visual demonstration. But food does have to be manipulated with the fork tine test. I don't know if Katrina wants to add or Luis wants to add, but there is some manipulation necessary for something that's molded. For instance, we're manipulating it in the puree levels. If something is minced and moist and cohesive, we have to manipulate it with a fork to separate the pieces. And so some manipulation is necessary.
Yeah, I think I would add here that with minced and moist, you're going to have a situation where there are small, soft particles or lumps of food in the bolus. And in fact, you wouldn't want them to be dry, separated particles because we want it to hold cohesively together. So in fact, these small lumps are likely to be in the bolus, and with applying the light pressure with the fork pressure test, they should be easily able to pass through those gaps.
Thank you, Katrina. Yeah.
I would amend that visual, I think, in the future. And so it's not clear, given that two of the attendees had questions about it.
Yeah. So thank you for bringing that to our attention. Alexander asks a question: what do you do for HCPs to know and share the IDDSI guidelines with their patients? Luis, we'll hand that one over to you if you don't mind.
Sure. So this is an evolving part of the implementation of IDDSI around the world, because, as you know, one of the reasons for the IDDSI framework is that it is usable in all different settings, and that includes the home. So we have to think about the healthcare providers in the different settings, but also the patients that then might go home or might go to other settings. So I think that's where, depending on the situation, depending on the patient, we do educate the caregivers on the different testing methods. And please remember that we do have an app for smartphones for both the Android and the iOS. So, and that has all the videos demonstrating all the different levels, as well as all the different documentation. So we also, on the website under resources, have some handouts for caregivers, and those may evolve or develop further over time as we learn more and more about what different caregivers are struggling with as they use the IDDSI framework at home. But that's always been the focus, to make it very user-friendly across all care settings. So it will require a little initial education, but people should feel comfortable by the support documents in the app.
Yeah. Okay, the next questions, Madeline asked the question of, why do you not include temperatures in the testing chart for testing at 15 minutes, 30 minutes, for example? Madeline, great question. With our revised documents that are coming out, there will be a slot to actually include temperatures, because we have heard from users, and again, thanks to all the users that provide feedback, this would be a very helpful thing to have on the audit tool. And for those that are auditing on a regular basis, it's a good way to capture data to say, when is it that the food, or what temperature is it that the food change in its behavior and may not be appropriate anymore. And following that was a question that is in regards to when is time 0 minutes for the chart? Is it the final heating temperature or at the time the food is served? Time 0 is the time when the food is served. So now, having said that though, I think we need to be careful about talking about when the food is served. Some people may misunderstand that as when it's plated, put onto a tray, and ready to be sent out. We're talking about the time when the food is put in front of the individual, just before they start putting it into their mouth. That really should be time 0. And so you may be doing testing once the kitchen's finished retherming and has put everything together either in bulk or assembled. But the 0 minutes is that moment when the food is presented to the patient and they are about to eat it. That should be considered 0 minute. There's another question here. If liquids change IDDSI levels with different temperatures, i.e. chilled to room temperature, is it safe to recommend a set IDDSI level? In practice, we know patients won't always take a product at the recommended temperature. Luis, I'll hand that one to you, please.
That's a really great practice question. And the truth is that many of us, as we've been, mapping the items in our menus to the IDDSI framework, have been keeping track of the temperatures at the point of service, or when the patient is about to consume the items. However, here's a nice play between the clinical judgment, right? The examination for swallowing that's been conducted, saying, this is the IDDSI level, or these are the IDDSI levels that this patient can handle, and then what is actually served to them. So no, I think we can clinically right now determine the IDDSI level that's appropriate for the patient. And then it's just looking at our menus and the items at the point of service to really ensure that those items are at that level. But this understanding of temperature is quite relevant, right? So an item that's cold versus an item that's hot versus room temperature, and maybe we need to test those items at those different potential temperature levels so that we know what the patient is actually getting.
Hey, thank you, Luis. Peter asked another question, which is, can you confirm that a manufacturer can state that in order to achieve a specific IDDSI level for food particle size, that the product can be cut by hand or mechanically processed and pass all IDDSI food tests for that level? For example, they could recommend the use of a level 7 product if it was manipulated by cutting it in advance in the kitchen to possibly achieve a lower IDDSI level. As long as the food tests and specific levels are applied, assume that they have passed each criteria. And I know that's a pretty long question. To break it down, yes, if you are currently producing an item that is a level 7, you can definitely provide your customers with instructions on how to be able to texture modify them to a level 6, level 5, level 4, as long as they are able to then test the product accordingly after they have altered the texture, so that they can be assured that they meet the testing criteria, or the outcomes for the testing criteria for the levels that you've indicated. This would be the same thing that we would do for those who develop recipes for customers. You would talk about the procedures for preparing something, and then ultimately at the end of the procedures, or at the final stages of the recipe, it would be ideal to specify the ideal temperature range for service, the testing methods that should be used, and if at all possible, as we mentioned before, what do you do when you find that it doesn't meet the testing method outcomes? And so if at all possible, if the products do not meet these testing methods, I think what we're really trying to ask all manufacturers to do is don't force them into an IDDSI level, because that would create more risk for consumers. And we would rather that it's not labeled as an IDDSI level, whichever. And I think the more information you can provide to the consumer, the better, so that they can make those decisions as to whether or not it is something that they can manage. Does anybody else in the panel have anything to add to that?
Yeah, Peter, I do. I think that as long as it's clear that without these special preparation techniques, the product is at its starting point, a level 7 in the case of the question. And as long as that's clear, I think it's good. Well, one of the things we talked about early on is whether it would be okay to send a product up in a hospital to a unit and expect either the patient or a caregiver to cut the product into bite-sized pieces, for example. And we decided that that's a risk level that most facilities probably would not choose to take, so that we can't rely on these human factors necessarily to understand the requirement or to execute the requirement. And so if you're trying to mitigate that risk, then it should be cut before it's sent. And so I think that's the opposite of this, but just clarity and communication is what we're asking for.
Yeah, thank you, Katrina. Well, it's how time passes when we're having fun. We would really like to thank everybody for attending the webinar. We know time is precious to all of us. We appreciate you taking the time to attend. We hope the information that we've presented and some of the virtual activities have been helpful for you. Again, please visit the IDDSI website for resources. If you have not had a chance to sign up for our monthly e-bites, please do so. We only send you news. We don't ever spam you. For those on the webinar who are not aware of sponsorship opportunities to support the work of IDDSI, please let us know if you'd like to support us. We'd be happy to talk to you. We want to thank once again all the lovely sponsors that have guided or supported our work so far. We thank all the volunteer board members for guiding the work and continue to guide the work. Just another reminder that certificates of attendance will be sent out to all participants who have joined us for only this live webinar, not for people who are listening in on this webinar afterwards on the YouTube channel. If you have joined us online, we already know who you are, but if you happen to join us by phone, then take a moment to email us to meetings@iddsi.org with your name, email address, and the phone number you called from so that we have a record of your attendance. So thank you once again, everyone. Please look forward to other webinars that we have in the works. They will be announced through the e-bite as well as the IDDSI website. Many thanks once again to Katrina, Joe, Luis for that wonderful presentation. We wish you all well. For those in Canada, happy Canada Day tomorrow. For those in the United States, happy 4th of July, and happy summer to everybody else around various parts of the world. Please keep safe and well. Thank you once again for being with us today.